Okay, if you've got your Bibles, can you turn to Hebrews chapter 12? We finally left chapter 11. And today we actually reach what I think is one of the pivotal points in the whole of the book of Hebrews. It's the focal point that the writer has actually been patiently building up to over all of the previous 11 chapters. Because now he faces us with a challenge. He's made his argument, and now he puts the ball firmly into our court and he says, here is what we need to do. And although up to now a lot of his argument has been leveled at a bunch of Jewish Christians who needed to be encouraged not to give up on their newfound faith, he now gets out his telescope and he looks down through the corridors of time to the 21st century. And he says, hey guys, this is for you too. You need to take hold of this and run with it. He's made his argument. Now he demands a response. Now, our journey through the book of Hebrews, and in particular the time that we spent in studying the characters highlighted in chapter 11, have taught us many things. But I think there's one thing that stands out above everything else, and it's this. You cannot live this life simply by the book. And by the book, I mean the Bible. Now, before you shout heretic, let me explain what I mean by that. So one of the principal arguments that the writer of Hebrews has been making throughout the book is that Israel had everything that they needed to help them to live as the people of God. You know, they had the patriarchs with whom God established covenant. They had Moses, who led them out of slavery in Egypt. They had the law to guide them and to give them a framework for godly living. They had the priesthood to teach them and to mediate their spiritual life. And then they had the prophets to bring encouragement and correction. They were God's special possession, and they were betrothed to him in a marriage covenant at Sinai. And yet, despite all that God had given them, for the most part, they continually complained and rebelled, they were disobedient, and they pursued foreign gods. They rejected the God who time after time showed patience and forgiveness and mercy when they turned back to him. And so Israel, in that sense, had the book. In other words, the law and the prophets. But it wasn't enough. You see, whoever you are as a member of the human race, in whatever time frame you live, the one thing that's guaranteed is that life is going to throw you a succession of curved balls that you're going to have to deal with. Now, don't misunderstand what I'm saying, all right? The book, the Bible, will help you. It'll give you a framework that will help you to make wise and godly decisions in response to those curved balls. It will teach you God's ways and how to live a life that pleases him. But there's one thing that's required that will bring the book to life and change the way that we live from an obedience-based law to sort of obedience based on law to obedience based on affection. And that's faith. That's what the writer has spent the whole of chapter 11 bringing to our attention, with example after example of faith at work in the saints of old who show us how they dealt with some of the curved balls thrown in their direction. And what makes the difference is that faith requires relationship. It brings us into a vital, vibrant encounter with the God of the Bible. And it makes the whole book come alive. So now this morning, as we come to the verses that I want us to focus on today, which is the first 3 verses of chapter 12, I just want to point out, as I've said several times before in the book of Hebrews, that the chapter break here is not helpful, because this is actually not a new subject, but it's really a continuation of chapter 11. Because as we'll see, these verses really make no sense unless we connect them and understand what has gone before. So let's read our verses. It's just 3 verses this morning. Hebrews 12 verses 1 to 3. Therefore, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us also lay aside every weight and sin which clings so closely, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us, looking to Jesus, the founder and perfecter of our faith, who, for the joy that was set before him, endured the cross, despising the shame, and is seated at the right hand of the throne of God. Consider him who endured from sinners such hostility against himself, so that you may not grow weary or faint-hearted. Now, those of you who were alive in the swinging 60s may remember that one of the most sought-after entries in the Guinness Book of Records at that time was how many people you could cram into a Mini. I think the current record is actually 28 people. There's videos that you could watch on YouTube, and it just seems incredible that all those people could fit into such a small space. Well, I feel that these 3 verses are a little bit like that. Just 3 verses, but they're packed full with important truth. And we're only going to be able to skim the surface today. Because the things like the tenses and the forms of the verbs, they're all full of meaning and implication. And even the distinction between what is singular and what is plural, it's all important. So we're not going to sort of, take it all to bits today. We haven't got time, but we are going to just pull out the main principles that the writer of Hebrews wants us to get hold of today. And to help us to get the most of these verses, I've actually included here a retranslation directly from the Greek that helps to bring out some of the subtleties of what the writer is wanting us to grasp hold of in these verses. It's not that our Bible translations are wrong, but it's just that they don't all fully convey some of the nuances contained within the original text. So have a listen to this. So therefore, since we are all surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses, we must keep running the race set before us with endurance, having put off every weight and the sin which has such a grip on us, continually keeping our eyes from distractions and fixing them on Jesus, who is both the initiator and the finisher of the faith. It was because of the joy set before him that he endured the cross, disregarding the shame it brought, and consequently, he has now taken his seat at the right hand of the throne of God. For you must give careful and constant thought to the one who endured such rebellion against himself, so that you might not grow weary and give in. Well, you might have detected 1 or 2 subtle differences in the text there, okay? The structure and the content, actually, of these verses is quite complex. So I just thought it might be helpful as well to break down the structure so that we can understand the text better. A lot of the New Testament writers seem to write in very long sentences. Paul writes in sentences that can be almost a chapter long, and this is actually only 2 sentences. So there are actually 2 main verbs. We must keep running in verse 1, and you must give careful and constant thought in verse 3. So I've just broken down the structure of the text to show the main clauses and the sub-clauses that will help us to grasp more fully what's happening here. So we start with a command. We must keep running with endurance. And then after that, he says, having put off every weight and sin that entangles, all right? Keep the command in focus, but these are other things that we will have done as well. Fixing our eyes on Jesus, who is the pioneer and perfecter of the faith. So we're now at level 3 here, all right? Who endured the shame of the cross, and who is seated at the Father's right hand. And then we have a second command, give careful and constant thought to him so you won't grow weary. So that kind of encapsulates what the text is actually saying. So verse 1 starts with one of the writer's favourite words, therefore. Now, we've already encountered this word many times in previous sessions. And so, as always, what's being conveyed here is that the thought process is being continued. So he's connecting what he's said before to what he's about to say. But he's not just connecting it in an etymological sense. He's also making a connection relating to the practical outworking of it. Although most translations use the word therefore, it could equally well be translated consequently, which I think actually gives us a better context for what he's saying here. So he's saying that in consideration of what he's said before, there must be a response. So in spiritual terms, the writer is asking us, have you been impacted by what you've just read? In other words, Hebrews chapter 11. In the mind of the writer, what he said before demands a response, and he's about to spell out what he considers that response should be, just in case we miss the point. But actually, I think he's referring to more than just chapter 11. I think he's asking us to take the whole of the previous 11 chapters into consideration. What has he said? Well, very briefly, if you've been tracking with us, some of these might sound a bit familiar, but he said he's talked about the superiority of Jesus in his person, the sufficiency of Jesus as our great high priest, the deficiency of man and our great need for a saviour, the superiority of the new covenant over the old covenant, the necessity of faith in order to persevere, the fact that God doesn't look for a flawless performance, but faith that leads to action. And then those who live by faith are strangers and pilgrims in the world. And lastly, the rewards of the life to come outweigh our comfort on this earth. Those are all themes that we've looked at over the weeks and months that we've been studying Hebrews. And so, having looked back, the writer now urges us to consider how we move forward from here. Immediately, the writer gives us another reason to help us to evaluate our response. He wants us to motivate us. He wants to motivate us to take the next step. So he appeals to what he calls the great cloud of witnesses. So who are they, and what does their witness mean? Well, I think clearly that he's referring to those he's just spoken of. Abel, Enoch, Noah, Abraham, and so on. The people that he highlights in chapter 11. All those who suffered and died, of whom the world was not worthy. Of course, there's more than just the ones that he mentions. That's why he calls it a great cloud of witnesses, all those who've gone before and all those around who are witnessing and testifying to the goodness of God. What does their witnessing refer to? Does it mean they're watching us from heaven like a company of spiritual cheerleaders? Well, I think the context of these verses says otherwise. And what's actually being referred to here is the witness of their lives to us. Even though they lived so long ago, the way that God commends each one of them for their faith, they have become a living testimony to us of the faithfulness of God. These are just snippets from the lives of saints who've run the race before us, and they shout down to us from the pages of history, by faith I finished the race, and you can too. And all this is underlined by what the writer says of Abel in verse 4 of chapter 11. He says, through faith, although he is dead, he still speaks. So we must let the faith of these ancient saints stir our own faith. They've gathered along the course of our own race, and they hold out their wounds and their joys to encourage us. And they say, go for it. You can do it. By faith, you can finish. Run. Go on, run hard. So now we come to the real meat of what the writer is laying out for us in these verses. So verse 1 says, we also must keep running the race set out before us with endurance, having put off every weight and the sin which has such a grip on us. So the first thing to note is that the writer writes inclusively here. So he includes himself among those that he's exhorting to run this race. He's saying that this is a response that everyone should make, myself included. There are no shortcuts in this race, and it's one that we must all participate in. Now, actually, the New Testament includes many different figures of speech to describe the Christian life. One of the most frequent is that of a race. Let's have a look at one or two examples. 1 Corinthians 9:24. Do you not know that in a race all the runners run, but only one receives the prize? So run, that you may obtain it. Galatians 5 verse 7. Paul says to the Galatians, you were running well, you were in the race. Who hindered you from obeying the truth? And then to Timothy he says, I have fought the good fight. I have finished the race. I have kept the faith. When I was at school, way back in the last century, I used to be pretty good at cross-country running. And at our school, we had two regular routes that we ran. The easiest of them was known as the frying pan because of the shape of the course. It went down, there was a fork in the road, you went round, and eventually you came back down the other fork. And this was over a length of about 4.5 kilometres, or in those days, we called it just under 3 miles. A good runner could complete the course in about under 45 minutes, although some took quite a bit longer. The thing is, although this was relatively easy, it was all on roads which were relatively flat, and most of us actually found it quite boring once you'd run it a few times. But the other route, however, was proper cross-country, with a couple of variations with steep hills, both up and down, gates to vault over, streams to cross, and often some proper mud. And if you were really lucky, there might even be cows in the field. And although this route was shorter, probably about 2 miles, it was far more interesting and stimulating because it involved using different running techniques, short strides up the hills, long strides down the hills, how to vault a gate instead of losing time opening and closing it. It was harder work, but much more interesting and much more rewarding, especially if you arrived intact and without injury at the finishing line. I think the race that the writer is describing here is at times like the frying pan, where the main effort required is to persevere. to press in and not give up. Sorry, that came up. To press in and not give up. Sometimes it's like day after day of the same old, when we sense a lack of motivation and our flame just seems to be burning low. Those are the days when we have to just dig our heels in and lean into Jesus for the power to persevere and endure. But then at other times, the race is like the proper cross-country run, with lots of ups and downs and other challenges to meet and overcome. And those are the times when we fix our eyes on Jesus, who's gone before us, to hear his voice leading us, enabling us to be victorious, learning how faith helps us to overcome in this life. But notice in the verse that we're looking at, verse 1, that this race has been set before us. So it's not a random series of unconnected events, but it's a course that Jesus has carefully prepared for us to run, with just the right elements in it to perfect who he is calling us to be. So for us, there will be places where we have the potential to win victories, but there are other places where we may suffer loss. There'll be forks in the route where we have to make choices, where the choices that we make will determine what the terrain ahead looks like and what we may encounter there. It's a race that requires endurance, where we have one goal in mind, and that's to get to that finishing line. And every step brings us closer. So we learn to pace ourselves, which means that we must learn how to discipline ourselves and how best to use the energy and the resources that we've been given. So this isn't passive endurance where we just put up with whatever comes our way. It's determination, it's unresting, and it's unhurried. It's steady, refusing to be deflected, endurance that just keeps on going. God never promises that it's going to be easy. Actually, interestingly, the Greek word that's used here for race is agon, from which we get our English word agony. Speaks for itself. But the good news is that this isn't a race that determines the winner. Everyone who endures to the end and crosses that finishing line is a winner, and they will receive a crown of glory. And really, that's what the rest of this passage this morning is all about. So, Hebrews 12, the continuation of the verse that we're looking at, verse 1 goes on to say, having put off every weight and the sin which has such a grip on us. So in order to run this race successfully, there is one thing that we must do, and that is to jettison the main thing that will prevent us from completing the race. And the writer gets straight to the point here and says that sin is what will hinder you from running this race. And the key that the writer gives us is what every successful athlete knows. The key to success is in preparation. The victory in any race is not determined on the day of the race, but in the weeks and the months beforehand. That's why the writer has taken so long to get to this point in his message. He's been painstakingly giving us some clues as to the weight that we need to lose. He tells us to run the race set before you. Don't stroll, don't meander or wander around aimlessly. Run this race as though everything depended on you reaching the finishing line. But this is where we have to be radical and ruthless. I think we understand the need to put off sin because the Bible is very explicit about that. But having said that, we must take this exaltation very seriously and keep our accounts with the Lord short. Sin will drive a wedge between you and the Lord and make it difficult for you to follow him. The only way we can put off sin is by repentance, where we turn away from the sin that entangles us and has a tight grip on us, and we walk in the opposite direction. So that's the first part, putting off sin. But there's a second part, which the writer says we must also put off, and that's every weight. And that's a little bit more tricky to deal with, because a weight isn't necessarily sin, but it is a hindrance. And it includes things that are not intrinsically wrong in themselves, but they may keep us from running as we should. And a weight is anything that hinders us from walking closely with the Lord. Something non-essential to our life in God, which consumes our time and our energy. A weight might be one thing for one believer and something else for another. It's anything that diverts our focus and our energy away from our wholehearted pursuit of Jesus. So we need every so often to evaluate what we're filling our time with. It's amazing how much baggage we pick up over time, just in the course of everyday life, really. It's not that we deliberately fill our lives with other things, but things that can eventually become a weight can creep up on us unawares unless we're vigilant. And during this last year, when we've had maybe more time on our hands than we used to have, what have you found yourself filling your time with? Now, only you can evaluate anything that might be a weight in your life. But I'm sure if you ask the Holy Spirit to highlight anything that could be classified as excess baggage, he would be only too willing to oblige. Because there is a cost for excess baggage. If you fly and you take excess baggage, they charge you for it. The bottom line is that Jesus wants you to succeed. He doesn't want you to fail. So he puts his finger on things from time to time. And if he puts his finger on anything in your life that may have become an idol or that's competing for your attention and affection, then I would advise you to take it seriously and deal with it. I know it's a tough one, and it's all part of the battle for holiness and purity that we face. Well, the writer goes on to the next verse, and here he begins it by saying, continually keeping our eyes from distractions and fixing them on Jesus, who is both the initiator and the finisher of the faith. And so the next key that the writer gives us has to do with our eyes and with our vision. We're in a constant battle, a battle for where we focus our attention. We have an enemy whose plan is to fill our time with things that appeal to our curiosity or that feed our desire to be entertained or persuade us to pursue worldly pleasures. Anything that will become a distraction and keep us from our devotion to God. God's desire for us is that we should find our fulfillment in the superior pleasures of knowing him, delighting in him, and walking in fellowship with him. Satan will focus our eyes on things that distract us. God will focus our eyes on things that fascinate us and fulfill us. The writer is telling us here that there are two things that we need to do. First, there's a looking away from that which will distract us, and then there is an intense and intentional looking to Jesus so that he fills our vision. Now, to fix your eyes on Jesus means that he becomes the supreme reference point for every aspect of your life. He's more than just your role model. He is the source of all spiritual wisdom. And in him is every spiritual blessing in the heavens. He is your source and your resource. And the writer here uses two words to describe how Jesus enables us to live by faith. He says that Jesus is the pioneer and the perfecter of our faith. Some translations say author and finisher. But actually, I think neither of these really gets to the heart of what's meant here. I think initiator and consummator might be a little bit closer to it. Jesus is the creator of faith, the object of faith, and the sustainer of faith. Now, in the Greek text here, the word faith is not preceded by the pronoun our. Instead, it has the definite article, the. So it's not our faith that's in question here, but the faith. And what does that mean? I think simply that it's referring to the kind of faith that is needed to endure. The kind of faith that he's been talking about in the previous chapter. So it's faith that's based in Jesus' faithfulness. Only Jesus can initiate and complete that kind of faith in us. And in the book of Revelation, Jesus is described as the Alpha and the Omega, the first and the last letters of the Greek alphabet, meaning that he is both the first word and the last word. Now, he is the pioneer in practical terms for us because he led the way for us to follow. Let's just look at two verses that will help us to see what the writer has in mind here. Romans 8 verse 29 says, "For those whom he foreknew, he also predestined to be conformed to the image of his Son, in order that he," that's Jesus, "might be the firstborn among many brothers." And then in 1 Corinthians 15:20, Paul says, "In fact, Christ has been raised from the dead, the first fruits of those who have fallen asleep. For as by a man came death, by a man has come also the resurrection of the dead. For as in Adam all die, so also in Christ shall all be made alive, but each in his own order. Christ, the first fruits, and then at his coming, those who belong to Christ." So Jesus was the first, the pioneer, the initiator. He led the way so that we can follow. So as we fix our eyes on him, we gradually come into alignment with his will and his ways. We become more like him as we're changed into his likeness. He initiates faith in us as a living entity that embraces the promises of God and makes them our own. Now, the second word that the writer uses is interesting because this is the only place that it's used in the whole of the New Testament. The word is best translated as consummator. And it's saying that Jesus is the one who brings the life of faith to its complete conclusion. And I think this concept of Jesus being the initiator and consummator works on many different levels. For instance, Jesus is the one who initiates our salvation on the cross at his first coming and consummates or completes it at his second coming. He's also the one who awakens love in our hearts by the revelation of his beauty, and then at the end of the age he will consummate that love as our bridegroom God in the marriage of the Lamb to the bride. Jesus was faithful to the end to complete everything that he began, which is why he speaks so often in his word about not giving up, not quitting, but enduring, persevering, pressing in, reaching for the prize. He wants us to cross that finishing line just like he did, so that he can reward us for our faithfulness. Well, the writer concludes this passage by telling us how Jesus endured the cross and what our response should be. He says, "It was because of the joy set before him that he endured the cross, disregarding the shame it brought, and consequently he has now taken his seat at the right hand of the throne of God. For you must give careful and constant thought to the one who endured such rebellion against himself, so that you might not grow weary and give in. Actually, Jesus fixed his eyes on something too. The thing that motivated him and kept him going was the joy that was set before him. Meaning that he was able to look beyond all the humiliation and the injustice and the pain of the crucifixion, because something better lay ahead for him. And the incredible, humbling, gut-wrenching reality is that he was talking about us. You and me, and countless broken, sinful human beings like us. That was the joy that was set before him. The reconciliation of God and man, and the pleasure that he felt in bringing many sons to glory. And it was because of this that he endured the cross. He became sin for us. He carried the wrath of the Father that should have been ours. He stood in the gap as our Passover lamb. He shed his blood and died a criminal's death instead of us. And for all this, God honoured Jesus by raising him from the dead and seating him at his right hand in glory. And what this says to us is, keep going, because there's something better up ahead. God is the rewarder of those who endure and don't quit. Whatever we have to go through now will pale into insignificance when compared to the joy that will be ours when we finally see him face to face. Which brings us to the last part of the text and the final word of exhortation. Now, most translations say, consider him. I think that's a bit weak. It almost sounds like it's one of many options. You know, the Greek word is a compound word, and it literally means completing a process of reckoning to a conclusion. So it's not just give Jesus a thought, but it's an intentional focusing our attention on him, learning how he dealt with adversity and injustice and becoming like him. And Paul sums this up beautifully in Philippians 3, which we've already heard this morning because this is the verse that Carol brought to us earlier on. Okay, and it says, and be found in him, not having a righteousness of my own that comes from the law, but that which comes through faith in Christ, the righteousness from God that depends on faith, that I may know him and the power of his resurrection, and may share his sufferings, becoming like him in his death, that by any means possible I may attain the resurrection from the dead. The writer wants us to be motivated to endure and to run the race in the same way that Jesus was sustained in his run. So where we fix our eyes, where we focus our thoughts and our vision, will determine the outcome of this race and how we deal with the obstacles that we encounter on the way. It's very likely that we will suffer some temporary losses in the course of this race. And that's why he counsels us to count the cost first. But it's not mainly about loss, but tremendous gain. It's just a matter of timing. We're being encouraged to see things through the eyes of God. And when we do, we find that there's just a vapor's breath of loss and pain, but that gives way to an eternity of joy that in every way will exceed our wildest dreams. There's a real nugget of wisdom contained in this last sentence of the passage. What is it that causes us to give up or lose heart? Weariness. Now, weariness can be caused by many things, and there's a difference between physical weariness and spiritual weariness. It can come from disappointment, shattered dreams, seemingly unanswered prayers, or the pressures of things like lockdown and loneliness. But just as a runner who's not in excellent condition gradually slows down and finally collapses, so with us, if we don't keep looking with faith to Jesus, we will eventually slow down and collapse too. We call it burnout today, and it seems that there are many who are weary in their souls. If you're weary, maybe you need to cast off some encumbrances that are slowing you down. The writer says that the remedy is to fix our eyes on Jesus. And fixing our eyes on Jesus will help us to combat and overcome weariness. Jesus himself said that if we're weary or heavy laden, we should come to him. And if we do, we'll find rest. His promise is that he will restore our soul. So if you begin to notice signs of weariness in your life, it may be that something is out of balance. Have you taken your eyes off Jesus and become distracted? I think Martha was becoming weary because, as Jesus said, she was distracted by many things. There's great wisdom in giving time to sit at the feet of Jesus. In fact, just sitting quietly in his presence, I find very restful for the soul. The Bible calls it waiting on the Lord. You can read about that at the end of Isaiah chapter 40. Waiting on the Lord brings us to a place of peace and rest. And in a process of divine exchange, our soul, our spirit, and even our bodies receive renewed strength and vitality. God takes our weariness and replaces it with his energy. He renews our vision and our ability to press on to that finishing line. Now, I want to finish this morning by introducing you to a remarkable lady. Anyone know who this is? Well, her name is Florence Chadwick. Anyone know what she's famous for? All right, let me give you a clue. She was a long-distance swimmer from San Diego in California, and she entered her first swimming competition at the age of 6. But it wasn't till the age of 11 that she won her first rough water swimming competition across the San Diego Bay. In 1950, she set her sights on what was seen as the greatest challenge for endurance swimmers, the English Channel. There'd already been several successful attempts at this, including one woman, Gertrude Ederle. However, all of these previous successes were achieved by swimming from France to England, which apparently, because of tides and currents and wind in the channel, was easier than going the other way. Florence's aim was to swim both ways, something that had never been achieved before. So on August the 8th, 1950, she set out from Cap Grisnez in France and arrived in Dover 13 hours and 20 minutes later, beating the previous record by over an hour. Then, in 1951, a year later, she returned to Dover to attempt the swim from England to France. The weather wasn't good, and after waiting 11 weeks for suitable conditions, she decided to set off anyway, despite dense fog and strong headwinds. The sea was so rough in the channel that she actually had to take anti-seasick medication. But eventually, she made it to Saint-Gat in France in a time of 16 hours and 22 minutes. The first woman to achieve this crossing. But then the next year, at the age of 34, she took on another challenge: to swim from Catalina Island to the California coast, a distance of 21 miles, which had never been swum by a woman before. On the day of her swim, the sea was icy cold and there was a dense fog over the coast. Oh, and there were sharks in the water too. She battled on for hours, but the fog made her unable to see her goal, and it felt to her like she was getting nowhere, like she was swimming round in circles. Eventually, after 16 hours, she felt that she couldn't go on and asked to be taken out of the water. And the sad thing is, she was actually only half a mile from her destination. She said afterwards, "Look, I'm not excusing myself, but if I could have seen the land, I know I could have made it." being able to see our goal is the key to winning the race of endurance. That's why it's so important that we fix our eyes on Jesus, that we keep him constantly in your vision, and you will succeed. And so my encouraging verse for you today, not surprisingly, is this one. Philippians 3:13, 2 verses today, and 14. Forgetting what lies behind and straining forward to what lies ahead, I press on in this race towards the goal for the prize of the upward call of God in Christ Jesus.